She didn't cry when he slapped her, but 5 years later the sting remained. The room had fallen quiet after the blow, but the silence had been loud in a different way. Margaret would later recall something Richard once muttered during a calm evening, as if quoting someone else, or maybe just himself. Even silence can be louder than a slap. It was a Tuesday, one of those brittle winter afternoons, when the light gives up early, and everything in the house feels colder than it should. The soup was still steaming gently on the stovetop, its scent carrots, beef potatoes mingling with the quiet. The curtains hadn't been drawn yet, and the pale sun stretched long shadows across the kitchen tiles. Margaret stood at the sink, drying her hands on the hem of her apron, while Brian paced near the doorway. His voice had already risen twice before she said a word. Across the room, Richard leaned against the archway between the kitchen and dining room arms, crossed, saying nothing. Brian's anger had started with money. It always did. Something about how she handled the property deed. Something about favoritism, how Emma would get everything while he, the only son, was being left crumbs. Margaret tried to explain, or maybe she didn't. It was hard to recall exactly now. What she remembered most was the heat in her son's voice, the sharp accusation, "You've always picked her. Even when I was a boy, it was always her." Then the word selfish, then the hand. It wasn't the pain, it was the weight, the finality of it. Richard moved, finally reached for Brian's shoulder, pulled him back. "That's enough," he said, but it came too late. Brian yanked free, stormed past the front door, slamming it with the kind of force people usually reserve for strangers. Richard stood there, not moving closer, not comforting, not asking if she was all right, just watching. Margaret turned away. She didn't weep. She picked up the bowls from the table, still full of soup, and emptied them into the sink. The spoon clinked against the porcelain. Her hand trembled just enough that the ladle knocked twice before she set it down. She folded the napkins slowly, smoothed the creases like she had done every night for 30 years. When she lifted the tablecloth, a thread caught on the wood, and she gently worked it loose. Her eyes never blinked too long, never shimmered. Richard had left the room. She heard the creak of the floorboards upstairs, his steps heavy and hesitant. That night, he didn't come down for tea. Days passed. Weeks. The slap was never mentioned again. But it lingered not just on her cheek, but in the hush between sentences, in the way her phone no longer buzzed with Brian's name, in the way Richard avoided touching her hand as they passed in the hallway. That winter, Margaret moved through the house like a memory that hadn't yet realized it was fading. She took longer to set the table. She refolded towels already neat. She double-checked the front door even after locking it. And then one evening, as she straightened the drawer near the sink, her fingers found something soft tucked beneath a stack of unused tea towels. Margaret opened the drawer and reached for the old woolen scarf, the burgundy one she had worn that day. The fabric was clean, mostly. But near the edge, stitched into the worn threads, was a faint brown stain. Margaret opened the drawer, took out the old wool scarf. A small spot of dried blood still marked its corner. The ranch was silent, except for Richard's last breath echoing through the hallway. It came softly, almost like a sigh, too tired to hold on. Margaret had been sitting beside the bed for hours, her hand resting lightly over his, both of their fingers, still warm, but slowing. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pot of tea had long gone cold. She remembered months ago Richard had written something on the back of a feed receipt and left it pinned to the barn door. "If I go first," it said in that half-shaky script, "make sure the horses still run." Now, as the sun edged over the hills, casting thin light across the eastern window, the only sound was the faint ticking of the old wall clock and the tail end of her husband's breath dissolving into stillness. Margaret leaned forward, pressed her lips against his temple, dry, cool, and then sat back, her spine straight, her face calm. There were no tears. She stood slowly, smoothed the edge of the quilt, and reached to close Richard's eyes. They had been blue once, clear and determined. Now they seemed empty of both worry and warning. In the hallway, she paused. The scent of the house lingered, hay dust, old saddle leather, and that stubborn trace of the anti-inflammatory ointment he used for his knees. Familiar, almost grounding. Outside, the horses hadn't stirred yet. They were waiting too. By the time Claire arrived, Margaret had already drawn the curtains, laid out a fresh shirt for Richard, and folded the linens into a neat pile at the foot of the bed. Claire said little. She simply walked in, placed a gentle hand on Margaret's arm, and began helping closing the windows, making the calls moving with the quiet rhythm of someone who understood what mourning without panic looked like. He said something before Margaret said once more to herself, about Brian, and a box in the shed. Claire glanced at her but didn't press. "Do you want tea?" "In a bit," Margaret murmured, already stepping into her boots. The morning chill nipped at her ankles as she crossed the yard. Dew clung to the edges of the grass. A single bird called somewhere far off its cry, short and melancholy. The door to the storage shed groaned as she pushed it open. Inside, the smell of aged wood and motor oil rushed up to meet her. In the far corner sat a low iron chest, the kind Richard had used back when they stored real tools, not just the sentimental kind. The latch clicked free, with surprising ease. Inside a faded wool scarf, 2 bolts for fence repair, and nestled beneath a cloth pouch, a silver chain, delicate, aged, unmistakably hers. She hadn't seen it in years. And underneath it, an envelope. No stamp, no seal. Her name in Richard's uneven handwriting. Margaret opened it slowly. A single line inside. "If anything happens to me, this proves your full right." No explanation. No date. But the words sat heavy, not just in the hand, but in the chest. She ran her thumb gently over the chain. Then she folded the note back, slipped both into her coat pocket, and turned to leave the shed. As she stepped back into the hallway, the light now falling stronger through the east-facing window, her phone began to ring. "Margaret Kathu va soi dai chuyen vao tui ao. Vualuk jien thoai jo chuong. Brian is on his way." He came in black, not for mourning, but for taking. From the far end of the chapel, Margaret could see Brian the moment he stepped in. His suit was too crisp, too deliberate, as if he were walking into a negotiation, not a farewell. Beside him, a woman, tall, polished, offered a closed-lip smile to the usher. Samantha, she assumed. They had never met. Claire leaned in. "That's him?" Margaret didn't answer. Her eyes remained on the figure weaving through the pews. Behind them, the stained glass window caught the late afternoon light, soft pinks and muted golds bathing the empty seats in reverence. Outside, the breeze tugged gently at the chapel flags. Spring was present, but only just. Margaret had prepared her eulogy the night before. Not on paper, but quietly in her head, while folding Richard's last set of clothes and watching the kettle boil. When the time came, she stood without notes. "My husband loved quiet things," she said, her voice even carrying without force. Old saddles, fresh hay, a well-oiled hinge. He never needed much, but he gave more than most. Her gaze never wandered toward Brian. Pastor John spoke briefly, more a formality than a sermon. Then the guests filtered out a few offering nods and murmured condolences. Margaret stepped outside, where the wind had grown gentler, almost warm. She turned toward the oak tree near the chapel gate, where Richard once said he'd like to rest, not buried, but remembered. A familiar voice broke the silence. Mom Brian said, approaching with Samantha at his side, "We need to talk about my share of the land." Claire, standing only a few feet away, visibly stiffened. Margaret didn't turn. She looked ahead at the chapel's edge where a few blossoms had begun to fall. Samantha offered a well-practiced smile. "It's a beautiful service, Mrs. Warner. You were very composed." Margaret blinked slowly. "We thought," Samantha continued, her tone syrupy, "that now might be a good time to discuss how the ranch will be restructured." Claire opened her mouth, but said nothing. The wind rustled again. Margaret reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers curled around the cold, smooth silver of the necklace. She didn't pull it out. She only held it. Her eyes, calm and unreadable, finally met Brian's. It was a gaze not of grief nor anger, just a deep, anchored stillness, like the ground before a storm. Brian looked away first. "We'll be back on Monday," Samantha said, with a hint of finality, her hand lightly brushing her husband's arm with the attorney. "We will return on Monday along with the lawyer." Monday arrived like a blade wrapped in silk. The sun filtered weakly through the east windows of the living room, casting soft lines across the old rug. Dust floated in the air, almost elegant, almost still. Margaret sat at the edge of the large armchair, a cup of tea resting untouched on the table beside her. Brian and Samantha arrived 5 minutes early, crisp and prepared. Claire opened the door for them, offered no smile, and quietly stepped back. Brian moved with the confidence of someone certain of his claim. Samantha carried a slim leather folder, her heels echoing lightly on the wooden floor. They did not sit until invited. "We'll keep this brief," Brian said, adjusting his sleeves. "Given I'm your only son, and Dad's no longer with us, it makes sense to formalize the split half the land, half the ranching rights." Margaret said nothing. She reached for the teapot and poured 3 cups, the steam rising in lazy curls. Samantha stepped forward, placing the folder on the table. "We've outlined a preliminary proposal. The lawyer will arrive shortly, Mr. Caldwell. You'll find it fair, considering everything." She opened the folder and slid out several neatly printed sheets. Asset lists, land values, diagrams of parcels. Her voice had the tone of someone reading from a report, efficient but distant. Margaret nodded politely, then stood. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving her tea untouched and the papers unread. Samantha blinked. Did she just leave? Claire shrugged, following Margaret with her gaze but not her feet. She has a habit of choosing silence over argument. Outside, the wind whispered through the fields. Margaret's boots crunched softly over the gravel as she crossed the yard toward the shed. The air inside was cooler shaded and earthy, with the scent of old tools and dry straw. She moved deliberately, pulling down an old metal box from the high shelf. Beneath faded receipts and scraps of cloth, she found it an envelope marked 1982. Inside was a copy of the original deed, and an older Will Richards' signature, clear and unmistakable. It spoke of love effort and land bought with every cent they had back then. Her mind drifted back to 1982. The earth had been softer, then newly tilled rich with spring. The day they signed the papers, Richard had pressed a clump of soil into her hand and said, "This land will outlive us, but let it remember who built it." They had no furniture yet, just a mattress on the floor, a single kettle, and a window that wouldn't shut properly. The nights were cold. They wore socks to bed. But she remembered the warmth, not from the blankets, but from Richard's voice when he said, "This is ours." The lowing of a distant cow brought her back. She tucked the envelope beneath her arm, closed the shed door gently, and returned to the house. Inside, the lawyer had finally arrived, tall, grey, and clearly impatient. Brian was speaking when she re-entered, but fell silent as she approached. Margaret said nothing at first. She placed the envelope on the table, slowly opened it, and pulled out the will. Then she looked directly at her son, her voice calm, deliberate. "I believe you forgot something. Some wars begin with documents, not declarations." The morning light was grey and soft as Claire's car wound through the quiet two-lane road into town. The hills rolled past like sleeping animals, and neither woman spoke. Margaret sat still in the passenger seat, her gloved hands resting on a worn leather notebook, Richard's initials faint on the cover. The town, modest and familiar, hadn't changed. The bakery still leaned slightly to the right. The old gas station sign flickered half-heartedly. When they reached the law office, Elkins and Hart, it stood just as Richard had described it. Years ago, weathered brick tall windows and the same brass doorknob cold to the touch. Inside, the receptionist looked up with polite curiosity. "Mrs. Allen, Mr. Elkins is expecting you." Margaret nodded. The hallway smelled of paper dust and lemon oil. Claire stayed in the waiting area watching the cars crawl by outside. Mr. Elkins was thinner than Margaret remembered. His suit hung loose on his shoulders, but his eyes were sharp behind the gold-rimmed glasses. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said quietly. Margaret placed the notebook on his desk. "I need to see Richard's files, all of them." He nodded once. "He sent something in 3 years ago. Said to file it under conditional addendum. Never asked us to execute it formally. Said it was insurance." Elkins pulled a brown folder from the bottom drawer, its corner sealed with wax. He broke the seal, slowly laying the contents before her. 2 pages. A supplemental clause to the will, handwritten and signed. It outlined Margaret's full rights over the ranch and lands if, at any time, the beneficiary attempts to coerce, manipulate, or threaten the estate's intentions. Elkins looked up. "He never wanted your son to touch this land." Margaret read the lines again. No anger crossed her face, only a tightening at the edge of her mouth. "I'd like a copy," she said. "You can take the original. He left it for you." As Margaret folded the pages into her notebook, the weight of silence returned. No courtroom, no arguments, just quiet, precise preparation. The receptionist looked mildly surprised when Margaret and Claire returned to the waiting room so quickly. Back in the car, Claire adjusted the mirror, stealing a glance at her friend. "Are you going to tell them Margaret didn't look up?" She traced the seal on the envelope with her thumb. "I'm already doing what I need to do." The drive home was uneventful fields, blurred past early crops, sprouting green and firm. As they turned into the ranch's long gravel driveway, the wind had picked up slightly, tugging gently at the gate's rusted hinges. That night after dinner, and a cup of chamomile tea, Margaret sat by the living room window. The notebook was on her lap, unopened. A single lamp lit the corner, casting warm shadows along the wall. At midnight, the wind died, and then the low crunch of tires. She didn't move, just listened. A car had stopped at the gate. Someone stood outside, watching. The dust-covered box had waited longer than she had. The west barn stood apart from the others, quiet weathered and half-sunken into the soft afternoon haze. A faint creaking came from the rafters, and shafts of golden light pierced through the narrow gaps in the boards, catching motes of dust that danced slowly in the air, like memories refusing to settle. Margaret stood at the doorway for a long moment before unlocking the latch. The old key scraped in protest, but finally gave way. The scent of aged hay, rusted metal, and pinewood met her like an old song, forgotten, but instantly familiar. She moved slowly, deliberately, stepping past saddle racks and feed bins until she reached the far corner. There, under a canvas tarp and an empty bridle hook, sat the small green tin box. It hadn't moved in years. She lifted it gently. The lid groaned open. Inside, a folded bank ledger, still crisp, though yellowed at the edges, Margaret's name clearly printed on the cover. a notarized power of attorney signed solely by Richard, and a black and white photo, faded but vivid in her mind, the two of them arms around each other, standing in front of the newly painted stables, both sunburned, smiling alive. She touched the image like one might a wound. In her memory, Richard's voice echoed low, steady, almost teasing, "Everything will come back to you, as long as you remember what's real." She sat down on an old wooden stool and let the silence close around her. The photo trembled slightly in her hand, not from age, but from the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her eyes drifted to the chain tucked beneath her blouse. The silver necklace had been tucked away since his funeral. Now, with reverence, she drew it out and clasped it around her neck. The locket rested just above her collarbone, cool and familiar. Outside, gravel shifted. She rose quickly and stepped to the narrow window that overlooked the outer field. Far off near the road, a dark car had pulled to the side. Parked. Empty. Watching. She didn't move. The car left after a few minutes. No one knocked. No one called. But she understood. They were measuring her silence, testing its weight. Not for the first time, and not for the last. Later, as the sun slipped behind the barn roof, Claire arrived, brushing hay from her coat as she stepped inside. Her eyes widened at the sight of the open tin and the items laid out neatly beside it. "You found it?" she asked quietly. Margaret nodded. "He never really hid it. Just waited until I was ready." Claire looked at her friend, necklace gleaming expression unreadable, and whispered, "If you wanted to, you could take this all to court." Margaret didn't answer immediately. She walked to the barn door, looked out across the quiet fields, and then toward the gate. Her voice was calm, certain. "Who says I haven't already started?" She wrote a letter she never intended to send until now. The wind had picked up again, pressing soft, persistent fingers against the old window panes. In the hush of her room, lit only by the warm, amber glow of the bedside lamp, Margaret sat at the small writing desk Richard had once repaired for her. The drawer still creaked when opened, and inside, nestled between old receipts and a dried sprig of lavender, lay thick, cream-coloured stationery. She dipped the fountain pen in ink. At first, the page stayed blank, longer than it should have. Then she began. Not with accusations, not with sorrow, but with the beginning. "We bought the first parcel in 1982. 5 acres. No fence, no house, just grass wind, and a shared breath of hope." Her handwriting was slow, steady. Each letter held the weight of things she hadn't spoken aloud in years. "You were 6 when you fell from the old mare. Your father panicked. I didn't. I stitched your elbow, made you soup, and slept beside your bed for 3 nights, until you stopped shaking." Margaret paused. The memory was so vivid it almost hurt. She turned to the photo she had chosen earlier, faded but clear. The ranch at dawn, just a frame of wood, a dirt path, and 2 shadows cast long across the land. She tucked it carefully into the envelope alongside the original bank ledger Richard had set in her name all those years ago. She continued, "I'm not writing to fight. I'm writing to remind, not of the land, but of the hands that shaped it. This is not about ownership. It's about memory. What's left when kinship is gone." The wind howled softly, as if it too had something to say. Claire appeared at the door. Sometime later, a mug of tea in hand. She didn't speak when she saw the letter already sealed, the wax still cooling. She simply placed the tea on the desk and gave Margaret a quiet nod. "I'm not sure he'll read it," Claire said. "I'm not sure he can," Margaret replied. "But he'll have to decide that for himself." She picked up the pen one final time and wrote on the front of the envelope in her clearest, most deliberate script, "Only open if you truly believe you deserve this land." The rest of the night passed in stillness. No more words, just the sound of the wind and the weight of something having shifted ever so slightly. When morning came, the light filtered in, pale and cool. Margaret placed the envelope neatly on the dining table, the same table where Brian had once spilled milk as a child, where Richard had signed his first cattle sale, where birthdays had been celebrated in silence and song. At 9 sharp, the front door creaked open. Brian entered, not bothering to knock. His shoes echoed on the hardwood. He saw the envelope, paused. Then, without reading the front, without a second glance, he pushed it aside with the back of his hand, like an unwanted flyer. He sat down instead and began to speak. Some friends offer cake. Others offer case law. The scent of chamomile tea lingered in the small office, blending with the faint whir of the ancient fax machine and the rustle of dry paper. Dust danced in a sunbeam that filtered through the window, casting shadows over stacks of worn legal books and folders whose tabs had long faded. Claire stood in the centre of it all, sleeves rolled up, hair loosely pinned. Her glasses rested low on her nose as she flipped through the documents Margaret had brought. This, she said, lifting the supplemental will with its fragile, time-stained edge, could change everything. Margaret didn't respond. She was seated near the window eyes, fixed on the wide field beyond. Horses moved slowly in the distance, tails flicking against the breeze. Claire had once been a legal secretary in her 20s, years before she met her husband, years before she traded typewriters for gardening gloves. But some instincts never faded. As she straightened the papers, her hands were steady, decisive. "I'll file the response under personal property protection and request a hold on any premature claims to the estate," Claire said, speaking half to herself, half to Margaret. "We'll need notarized copies and, yes, this." She slid open a drawer and retrieved a hardback folder. The edges were lined in metal, the kind used when permanence was the point. Margaret handed her the bank ledger, the property deeds, the letter from Richard. She said nothing, but her movements were deliberate. There was a quiet resolve in the way her fingers lingered just a second longer on each page before releasing it. The fax machine beeped as Claire fed in the first stack. Its screen blinked, connecting, transmitting. Outside, wind stirred the tall grass. A bird landed on the sill and watched them, curious, but silent. "You still haven't said whether you want to fight?" Claire murmured, not turning from the machine. Margaret's eyes stayed on the distant barn. "I'm not fighting. I'm protecting what's already mine." Claire nodded, as if that answered every question. She walked to the copier, its hum adding to the rhythm of the room. Pages fed through. Clicks. Whirs. The occasional hiss of the printer warming again. When the last of the papers was compiled and clipped into the file, Claire reviewed the checklist. "County Court should receive the originals by noon. I'll follow up with a hard copy." Elkins confirmed receipt of the faxed summary, she added. "He'll notify us if anything changes." Margaret reached for the tea Claire had poured earlier. It had gone lukewarm, but she drank anyway. They sat for a while, just the two of them in the small room full of dust and legacy. Then, with a faint buzz, the fax machine chirped again, this time not to send, but to receive. Claire stepped over eyebrows, knitting. A new email had also arrived. Her phone vibrated with a short chime. She picked it up, staring at the screen. The subject line read, "Urgent, ongoing inheritance dispute." Claire looked at Margaret. "It's begun," she said quietly. Margaret didn't flinch. She simply returned her gaze to the fields. By the time Brian arrived, the sign was already nailed to the gate. The wind had not rested all morning. It howled through the cottonwoods, sent dry leaves scattering across the gravel path, and pulled at the corners of Margaret's coat as she stepped through the wooden archway toward the gate. The metal hinges groaned faintly behind her, rusted from seasons of neglect, but still holding. She carried no weapon, no lawyer, no raised voice, only a laminated sheet of paper and a hammer. Claire stood back by the porch, watching but not intruding. Beside her, a folded envelope, one of many backups Margaret had prepared the night before, lay on a wooden crate. The nails made no dramatic sound, just quiet taps, steady and deliberate, as Margaret affixed the document to the right panel of the gate. Temporary access. Restriction. Property under active legal dispute filed under District Court File 17384 AL. Effective immediately, per counsel of Elkins and Associate. The ink was bold, the corners laminated. It would not tear easily. A vehicle approached Brian's silver truck, fast, its tires spraying dust and dry stones. It halted too quickly, lurching forward an extra foot, as Brian slammed the door and stepped out Samantha not far behind. "What the hell is this?" Brian's voice cracked through the wind. "You're locking me out of my own land." Margaret didn't flinch. Her hands rested on the gate's top beam. The hammer was already down by her side. Samantha caught up, laid a hand on his arm. "Not here," she whispered, her voice low but urgent. "The neighbours are watching." Indeed, across the narrow road, old Mr. Harris had paused mid-rake. He stood by his fence, one hand shielding his eyes, quietly taking in the scene. Brian's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, yanked the paper loose. Margaret didn't raise her voice. "Let the court decide," she said calmly. Her tone had the weight of worn earth and old wood, solid, unmoved. Claire stepped forward from the porch, holding a second copy. Without a word, she reached out and in 3 clean motions pinned it back into place. Brian stared at her, then at Margaret. "You've lost your mind," he muttered. "First you write me out of everything. Now you're parading it for the whole damn county." "No," Margaret said. "I'm ensuring it stays out of hands that never helped build it." The wind tugged again at her scarf. Samantha turned toward the truck. "Brian." "Enough." Reluctantly, he followed. His boots scraped the gravel louder than necessary, but he didn't look back. Claire remained by the gate, gaze flicking between the distant truck and the laminated page, now swaying slightly with each gust. Across the road, Mr. Harris gave one small, deliberate nod. Not to Brian, to Margaret. Then he turned, stepped back into his yard, and closed the gate behind him with a soft, firm thud. She hadn't used the Spanish teacup in years until today, when her hand reached for it without thinking. The afternoon light was thick and golden, casting a warm sheen across the dining room floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams that filtered through the faded curtains. The old wooden tea cabinet stood in the corner, quiet and unassuming, its doors slightly misaligned after decades of use. Margaret stood in front of it, searching for the usual china she used every morning. But her fingers stopped, drawn toward something else. Without meaning to, they curled around the delicate porcelain cup, painted with blue vines, brought back from Seville over a decade ago. The glaze had dulled, but it still shimmered faintly under the sun's caress. She hadn't touched that cup since Richard passed. Claire was seated at the table, sorting through a stack of envelopes. Her eyes lifted when Margaret poured the tea. "That's not your usual cup," Claire said gently. Margaret didn't answer right away. She opened the tea cabinet, fully reaching toward the back, where old tins were tucked behind mismatched saucers. As she pulled one out, a rectangular tin, wrapped in brittle lace, a folded sheet of paper slipped free and floated down like a falling leaf. She bent to retrieve it. A bank certificate. Spanish. Issued in 2009. Account holder Margaret R. Walker. Balance substantial. Several zeros, signatures, stamps, and a final note in Richard's handwriting, "For you when you need more than memories." Her breath caught. The edges of the paper trembled in her grip, not from fear, but the jolt of something long forgotten returning like an old friend. Claire stood, walked over. "What is it?" Margaret didn't respond. Her fingers traced the paper's creases, as if trying to read between the folds. The cup now sat quietly on the table, filled with tea she no longer wanted. She sat down, eyes fixed on the gentle ripples in the liquid, disturbed only when the wind tapped at the window. In her mind, she saw a memory unfold. Seville, a small courtyard, Richard handing her the cup, laughing as pigeons scattered. "This one," he had said, "is not for the shelf. It's for the quiet days when you need reminding." He had touched her wrist. "Not everything should be left for our son. Some things should only ever be for you." The warmth in that moment ached now, the tenderness of a love that had hidden truths, not out of deception, but to protect. Claire sat beside her again. "Do you think—" He knew all this would happen. Margaret didn't answer. Her gaze returned to the tin. Nestled inside where the certificate had fallen from was a small piece of cloth, a protective lining. She lifted it and found tucked in the corner a tiny brass key, smooth worn but unfamiliar. She turned it in her palm, testing its weight. "I've never seen this before," she whispered. Claire leaned closer. "Then maybe it's time you find what it opens." The light through the curtains had shifted to amber, now casting long shadows across the floor. But the key remained in Margaret's hand, cool and silent, like an invitation to the next chapter of a story only she could unlock. The door creaked open, like it had been waiting to confess. Margaret held the flashlight low, its amber beam barely pushing through the thick quiet. The wind had stilled, and even the trees seemed to hold their breath. She stood before the western stable, the oldest one, long unused half, covered in ivy, with rust streaking down the hinges like dried tears. The key trembled in her hand, more from memory than cold. Richard had always meant to restore this place. "Not for the horses," he once said, "but maybe for me." She never asked what he meant. She should have. The small side door clicked open. The air inside was thick with dust and oil. Her beam caught the curve of old saddles, a broken hay rake, and a desk shoved into the back corner. It was the desk that stopped her old familiar. They had sanded and varnished it together the year Richard tried to be more organized. It hadn't lasted long, but now it felt like a tombstone with a drawer. She pulled open the middle drawer. Inside, wrapped in plastic and time, lay a small brown envelope, a thick leather-bound ledger, and a folded letter marked simply M. Her breath caught as she sat on the stool beside the desk. The flashlight rested against a tin cup, its beam casting long shadows across the stable walls. She opened the letter. "Margaret, I never had the stomach for confrontation. You know that. Maybe you always knew. I let Brian grow into someone I couldn't recognize. I saw the signs, how he forged the figures in the feed order, how he claimed expenses that weren't his. I told myself it was youth, or pressure, or my fault. But it wasn't just numbers, it was character. This land deserves more than entitlement." I couldn't tell him, but I can tell you. If you're reading this, then you found what I didn't have the strength to say. Margaret stopped. Her hand rested on the letter fingers, trembling slightly. The paper smelled faintly of hay and engine oil, like the early years. She opened the ledger, Richard's handwriting page after page. Bank records, inventory, maintenance schedules. And notes, sharp, precise, written like a man who had been watching everything just in silence. One page near the back was marked with a red tab. Draft, final will and testament unfiled. Sole beneficiary, Margaret R. Walker. Rationale, Misrepresentation of Financial Records by Brian Walker, Chapter 17, April 2020. Confirmed. She lowered the book slowly, the edges of her scarf brushing the table. Outside, the wind returned gentle at first. She sat for a while, not crying, just thinking. Should she be angry, relieved, vindicated, perhaps all at once? The flashlight flickered. She looked up. There, at the far end of the stable, past the slats in the wooden wall, something moved. A silhouette. Not close, not advancing, but unmistakably human. Watching. She rose. The beam of her flashlight cut across hay dust and broken boards, but by the time it landed on the corner, the figure was gone. She hadn't seen her granddaughter in 2 years, and Emma looked nothing like the child she remembered. Margaret opened the door just as the morning breeze swept across the porch, carrying with it the faint scent of tea and rustling leaves. For a moment, she thought her eyes had tricked her. But no, there she was. Emma. No longer the awkward child who once rode the ponies barefoot. She was taller now, shoulders squared, her hair pulled into a soft braid. Yet it was the eyes, those steady hazel eyes, that stilled Margaret's breath. "Hi, Grandma," Emma said softly, before Margaret could say a word. And then the girl stepped forward, wrapping both arms around her like she'd never left. Margaret held her close. They sat on the front steps, the wood warm from the sun. Claire appeared briefly at the doorway, blinking in surprise, but chose not to interrupt. She nodded once and stepped back inside. Emma reached for the cup of tea Margaret had set down moments earlier. Without asking, she poured her own from the pot beside them. "Dad doesn't know I'm here," she said, watching the steam rise. "I heard about the lawsuit." Margaret said nothing. Her fingers rested gently on the lip of her cup. "They argue all the time now," Emma continued. "Mom keeps saying Dad isn't pushing hard enough. He says the paperwork's more complicated than he thought. But I found one of her emails. She was telling him to pressure you to push past the legal process." She looked sideways at her grandmother. "I didn't want to believe it, but I saw it." Margaret reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out the silver necklace, the one Emma used to play with when she was little. "You remember this?" she asked, letting it dangle in the light. Emma's face softened. "Of course. You said if I ever dropped it, I'd have a whole year of bad luck." "You never did." Margaret smiled. They drank in silence for a while. Then Emma asked, If something ever happened to you, would I still be allowed to come here? Would the ranch still feel like mine too?" Margaret turned toward her eyes, thoughtful. "I'm trying to keep this place not for old times," she said, "but because if I can, maybe it means there's still a thread unbroken, a way for you to come back, not as a guest, but as someone who belongs." Emma blinked fast. "I don't want this to be just a courtroom fight. I want it to stay a memory." Margaret reached out, took her hand. "If I can keep it," she whispered, "then it's because of you." A long gust of wind passed through the trees. Emma hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket. "I wasn't sure if I should bring this," she said, pulling out an envelope. "Dad left it open on the printer last night. He doesn't know I saw it. But I took a picture." She passed it to Margaret. The paper inside was folded sharply, the kind of crisp edge that came from intent. "I thought you should see it first," Emma added, "before they come back next week." Margaret unfolded the page, but we don't yet see her reaction. Instead, she looked back at Emma and smiled faintly. Not with ease, but with clarity. It took only one photo to make everything fall into place. The room was quiet. Not silent in grief or tension, but quiet in the way a still lake waits before dawn. The lamps cast a soft glow across the cream-coloured tablecloth, its edges slightly frayed from decades of use. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her teacup untouched, her gaze fixed not on the cup, but on the photograph lying beside it. Emma stood to the side, hands clasped tightly, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. Claire's arms, folded loosely, hovered in the background, watching. On the table was a printout. Full color, crisp resolution. It showed Brian in a law office. His posture was casual, almost smug, as he leaned over a legal document. Samantha was beside him, pointing at a section of the page. His pen hovered above the signature line, caught in the moment of claiming what he believed was already his. The timestamp at the bottom corner made Margaret's fingers tighten slightly. It was dated 3 weeks ago, long before the official probate hearing had even been scheduled, long before Brian had ever mentioned needing to discuss the land. "He didn't think I'd see it," Emma whispered. "But he left the file open on the desktop while I was doing homework. I knew it looked wrong." Margaret didn't speak. Claire stepped forward, eyes scanning the image. "This isn't just arrogance," she said softly. "It's anticipatory appropriation, an attempt to execute ownership without consent. The court doesn't look kindly on that." Emma looked from one woman to the other. "Did I do the right thing?" Margaret finally turned to her. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "You didn't have to do anything, but you chose to. That matters." Claire nodded gently, placing a hand on Emma's shoulder. "You've done more than most adults would have had the courage to." Emma smiled faintly, then excused herself. "I'll be in the guest room. I just need a moment." The hallway light faded as her footsteps disappeared. Margaret remained at the table. Her eyes drifted from the photograph to a framed picture tucked beside the teapot, a wedding photo, decades old. She and Richard standing beside a white fence, hands entwined dust from the fields, still on their boots. She studied it for a long time, as if measuring who she had been then against who she was now. Then calmly, she reached for the phone and dialed. A voice answered. She didn't flinch. "We're ready," she said. Claire moved closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you want to face him in court?" she asked. "Or do you want to do it right here in this house?" Margaret looked around the room, the walls steeped in memory, the tablecloth worn by time, the scent of lavender. Richard always loved lingering in the air. Her expression didn't change, but her answer was coming. The kettle began to whistle, just as Brian stepped into the kitchen, sharp and sudden, like a warning. Margaret didn't move. She remained seated at the old table, her back straight, hands resting on the rim of a teacup that still steamed gently. The same table where 5 years ago she'd been struck silent. The same room. Claire sat across from her, silent as well. Her eyes flicked to Brian but said nothing. She was here as witness, not participant. The door creaked closed behind him. "I'm not here to make trouble." Brian began, his tone measured, almost casual. "I just think we've let this get out of hand. We can fix it quietly, without courts, without drama." Margaret didn't respond. She reached to her left, picked up a thin folder from the table, and slid it across the wood toward him. He looked down. First at the cover sheet, then at the court stamp, the judge's initials, and the title, Interim Injunction on Disputed Properties Pending Investigation of Fraudulent Action. His fingers twitched. "What is this?" he asked, flipping the pages quickly. Claire answered without looking up. "It's the court's acknowledgement. Based on the evidence, primarily the preemptive signature on land transfers, it's enough to freeze the estate until final ruling." Brian's jaw clenched. "You had me followed." "Is that it? Some kind of trap?" "No," Margaret said. Her voice was quiet, but clear. "You left your footprints everywhere. I just picked them up." She reached again, this time for a second sheet, the photo. Brian, signing Samantha, pointing timestamp visible. She laid it on top of the folder. He stared. His nostrils flared. So now what? You want to see your son dragged through court. You think that's what Dad would have wanted? Claire glanced toward Margaret but stayed silent. Margaret didn't blink. Your father left this house knowing I'd need to protect it. From strangers. I just never thought the stranger would be you. Brian stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the old tile. Fine. You win. You've poisoned everyone against me. No, Margaret said gently. You did that yourself. He paused, his eyes searching hers for anger, perhaps, or regret. But there was nothing left to find. Just the steady calm of someone who had spent a lifetime surviving storms bigger than pride. You always chose Emma, he said bitterly. Always. Margaret's face softened, not with apology, but with something more final. I chose the one who still sees this house as home. Brian said nothing more. He turned and walked out. The screen door slammed behind him with a finality that didn't ask for forgiveness. The kettle had stopped whistling. Only the soft hum of steam lingered in the air. Margaret looked down at her cup, still untouched. She reached for it, slowly brought it to her lips, but paused. Some things she thought were better when left to cool. The envelope lay on the table, pale cream against polished wood. No return address, just her name written in a hand that didn't rush Margaret Walker. Claire stood by the door holding her coat. It came in this morning. I thought you might want to open it alone. Margaret gave a soft nod. Thank you. After Claire left, the house returned to silence. Only the occasional creak of warming floorboards and the slow breath of morning wind through the window cracks. Margaret sat down. Carefully, she slit the envelope open. The letter was handwritten on thick paper, the kind people rarely used anymore. Dear Margaret, you don't know me, but I knew Gregory. Not deeply. Just enough to remember him with a warmth that time never touched. I bought your silver necklace a few weeks ago, not because I collect such things, or because I thought it would ever be worn again. I bought it because Gregory once showed it to me and said, this was the first promise I made that I never broke. He told me it belonged to you, that it always would. Margaret's fingers brushed the edge of the letter. The words continued even more softly now, as if the ink carried the voice itself. I'm sending it back to you where it belongs. No need to return the payment. He would have hated that kind of fuss. He also told me once during a hard year that if you ever had to fight alone, you wouldn't lose. I believe that too. Warmly, Lorraine Margaret folded the letter with care. There were no tears, only a stillness in her chest that settled like dust after a storm. Just then, Claire returned quietly and held out a small velvet box. Inside lay the silver necklace, cleaned but unchanged. The clasp slightly bent, Margaret remembered that flaw. It had been there since the year Claire was married. She reached for the chain, slowly bringing it to her neck. The clasp clicked into place. For the first time in months, she looked into the mirror. The pendant caught a shaft of sunlight through the curtain, scattering light across the wall like a memory refusing to fade. Behind her, Claire's voice was almost a whisper. Will you wear it to Emma's graduation? Margaret didn't answer. She simply smiled. The lilacs had bloomed. Their colour spilled in gentle purples along the old fence line, stretching toward the corner of the garden where the earth was still damp with morning dew. Margaret stood quietly, hand wrapped around the watering can's handle, watching the petals sway in the early spring breeze. 5 years ago, the bush had been brittle, almost dead. She had nearly dug it up. But Gregory had insisted. Wait another season, he'd said. She was still waiting. And here they were. Emma's footsteps broke the stillness. She ran across the grass, her hair tied back, her smile unguarded. "Bar," she called, arms flung wide. Margaret turned just in time to catch her. The girl smelled of fresh soap and wind. They stood for a long moment, neither letting go. "Did you see the lilacs?" Emma asked. "I did," Margaret replied. "And they saw us too." Behind them, Claire stood at a distance with a steaming cup of tea, letting the moment be theirs. Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. One unread message from Brian. "I'm sorry, Mum. I understand if you're not ready, but if one day you are, I'd like to try again." She read it twice, then locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the garden bench. Later, she and Emma knelt by the lilac bush. Margaret showed her how to trim back the stems gently without hurting the bloom. "Always cut just above the bud," she said, "and never when it's too wet. The roots remember." Emma nodded solemnly. Margaret removed the silver necklace from around her neck and placed it gently into Emma's palm. "It's not for today," she said, "but one day when you know why it matters, you'll wear it." Emma closed her fingers over it. "I already know," she whispered, "because you never gave up on what was right, even when everyone else walked away." Margaret looked at her granddaughter. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The air was still but full of lavender, of sun, of things returning. She turned to the lilac bush once more. The blossoms swayed unapologetically late. "Some things bloom late," she said softly. That's all. The lilacs bloomed once more, not just in the garden, but in the quiet spaces where dignity had been bruised and nearly forgotten. Margaret never raised her voice, yet every action, every pause reclaimed a truth no courtroom could ignore. Justice may arrive late, but it resonates like the final chord of a long-forgotten melody, clear, undeniable, and deeply earned. Sometimes it only takes one silent woman standing firm to remind the world what legacy truly means. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you resonate with this story.